You're listening to Forge Theater Labs,
a podcast devoted to exploring theater history.
Where does that idea come from?
concepts in storytelling.
Is anything that original?
Isn't that just an assumption?
And the creation of theater from behind the scenes.
How do they even do that?
This is Forge Theater Labs.
History, innovation, perspective.
Welcome to Forge Theater Labs. I'm Josh Hsu, your host, and today I am really thrilled to have on Dave Register to talk a little bit about his experience as an emerging artistic director, an emerging director, and his experience at Portland Theater Festival. Today we're going to talk about longevity, adaptability, and artistic leadership, and what it really takes to build work across mediums, to sustain an institution, and to keep curiosity alive as responsibility grows. First, let's welcome Dave. Hi, Dave.
Hi, Josh. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. For those of you who don't know Dave Register, Dave is a graduate of Columbia's University MFA program. Dave Register is an actor, acting coach, director, and artistic director of Portland Theater Festival, now celebrating 5 years of artist-centered, process-driven work. His career spans theater, appearing in Harry Potter and the Cursed Child, and Tom Stoppard's Leopoldstadt and Screen, including his work on Fallout Season 2, now out on Amazon Prime. Dave brings a rare fluency across scale, medium, and audience, and I'm so thrilled to welcome him to Forge Theater Labs. On top of that, he's a talented drummer. For those of you who didn't know, you can also hear Dave playing drums on the intros to Season 0 of Forge Theater Labs. So Dave, you just sort of, wrapped Fallout. All the seasons are out. Tell me, what skills from working on a project like Fallout unexpectedly help you most when running a theater festival?
Well, thank you, first of all, for that really nice introduction, Josh, and for shouting out my drummer skills. That was a nice, unexpected surprise. But I do every once in a while like to bang around on the drums. So, Fallout is a huge world. And for anybody who's watched the show, particularly this most recent season, it's covering a lot of ground. There's 5 or 6 different central storylines and dozens of characters, and it's a lot. And what that means from a production standpoint is an equally, large, multifaceted, varied crew and production team. And I guess one of the big things that I've taken away from working on Fallout and have brought back to the festival is this appreciation for scope and scale, and particularly the need for diversification of leadership. The buck has to stop with somebody, but the more people, at least in the case of Fallout, production heads, department heads, the more people who are empowered to make big decisions, the stronger the product's going to be, and the smoother the operation in general will be. So, we, from a really early place at PTF, we've had a number of people in charge, and that has made everybody's lives easier, and I think it's contributed to some of our success. The other thing too is I guess on a production like when running a festival, there are so many unexpected variables, and things will change all the time. Plans, the day's schedule, travel. There are all of these variables that you just can't control, and this happens all the time on set. You go in expecting to shoot on a Friday morning, and next thing you know, it's Monday afternoon, and you've been sitting around the hotel waiting for the call. But you need to be nimble. You need to be sort of deft at pivoting. And I've come to, I don't want to go so far as to say that I look forward to things going wrong or plans changing at the festival, but I've grown to not fear them as much as see them as opportunities.
Absolutely. I think, one of the things that we do in theater is spend a lot of time planning, and there are all these variables, and obviously that comes with stress, and our hope is that we sort of hit everything, but it's sort of, those discoveries in the room, the sort of uniqueness of experiences often come to fruition because of unexpected challenges, because of unexpected discoveries. I can't use this set piece anymore, so now I have to sort of make that adaptation.
Absolutely.
For those of our listeners who are unfamiliar with Portland Theater Festival, can you give us a little bit of background about how it came about, how you landed on it? Obviously you're a Maine native, so, any sort of background you can give would be helpful.
I say yes. As you mentioned, I was born and raised, grew up in Maine. I left for New York for college when I was 18, but I was coming back to Maine pretty much every summer since I left, and come between college semesters and then afterwards, even when I was starting out my career and working, I would always come back to Maine in the summer. And I always had this vague thought at the back of my mind that it would be so great to start a theater company someday in Maine. But I had this kind of it's this sort of misconceived notion that, it had to happen in this almost formulaic way. Like I had to be at a certain place of establishment in my career, or, I had to have a certain amount of money in order to fund the thing myself. And it just kind of stayed there in the back of my brain. I never entertained it as a real possible, as a possibility. And then when the pandemic hit, I had been living in LA. I was working out there. Obviously, the whole industry and the world at large came to a grinding halt, and I came back to Maine to be closer to my family, most of whom are all still in and around Portland. And while I was there, I got this idea to just produce one play. There was no idea. I had no sort of grand designs to produce a festival at this point. It was just I had this one play in mind, which was Annie Baker's play The Aliens, which is a play about three sort of young, disaffected guys living in Vermont. And they spend their days kind of loitering behind a coffee shop in the employee break area. The catch is that they're not employees of this coffee shop, so they're just guys sort of hanging out in an area, trespassing, I guess is the word. And these sort of two friends kind of form an unlikely friendship with a young guy who's an employee of the shop, who is given the unfortunate task of having to come out and tell them that they can no longer hang out back there. And then this kind of beautiful, unexpected sort of three-way relationship ensues between them. And, I got permission to produce this behind Tandem Coffee Roasters down in East Bayside. We did it outside, sort of site-specifically. That was both, because the play called for it, and also as a sort of safety precaution. This was 2021, so COVID was still very much a thing. And the show was very successful. It ran out its 8-show run. It sold out its 8-show run, rather. And everybody that I talked to afterwards who came to see it kept asking me, what are you doing next? What are you going to do next summer? What are you going to do next summer? And I kept saying, we're not doing anything next summer. There's no plans to do anything next summer. This was a one-off. This was in some ways, I was in this play. This was in some ways, meant to give myself a job. But, it got me thinking, hey, maybe this is that moment. Maybe this is the company moment that you've always been thinking of. And what would it be like to go out and really try to raise money for this? And I did one show this summer. Why don't we do 3 next summer and really make it a season? And that's what we did. And that was 5 years ago, almost 5.5 years ago.
Incredible. For our listeners who don't know, Parker Huff was actually in that production of Aliens and a guest artist last season. And Sam Rapaport is our technical producer and editor this season. And he was also in the Aliens. So it's a small world.
It's a small world, small town for sure. Shout out to Parker and Sam. They were actually, I should just mention briefly that this goes back even further, because my longtime collaborator Barry Robinson and I were teaching a Zoom acting class during the pandemic. This was started in 2020 in December, and we were directing Parker and Sam in a scene from the Aliens. And I remember sitting there watching them one day, and I'm thinking, they're so good. They're so good. If only there was a third person who could play the third character in the play. We could do this play in Maine behind a coffee shop. And then, a few minutes later, I realized that I could be that person, and that if I wanted to produce it, I could give myself the luxury of casting myself in the production. But I really feel a strong appreciation and sense of debt, gratitude to Parker and Sam for being the very first actors in PTF along with me.
I love that idea that you sort of found these actors that were really good in a classroom setting and sort of shepherded a play into sort of a larger production. Thinking about that, is that a value that you've sort of continued to look at as you're sort of developing? Like, when did that sort of scrappy experiment, like, did that become part of formalizing the process, knowing that you had this cast to sort of deliver a project, or, has it changed over time?
Yeah, there's always a calculus when Barry and I are choosing the season. It's sort of a combination of who do we know who's available locally, or who do we really like locally and want to feature in a show. And we kind of take stock of who's around, because part of our mission is creating opportunities for Maine artists. We do hire some out of town artists when the play calls for it, and we can't cast those roles locally, but we are always looking to showcase Maine actors whenever possible and as much as possible. So yeah, I mean, Barry and I have continued to teach a version of that class now ever since. So it's called R&R acting. We've been doing it now for, I guess it's been about 5.5 years, and it started online. It's morphed into in person. Barry taught 3 classes last summer while he was in Portland doing primary trust, and we are sometimes in a position where we'll see somebody or we'll see a scene in class and we'll go, this is so good, we just simply have to do the play. But other times, we find a play that we're really passionate about, and then we sort of go, well, let's see who's potentially good for this. We'll audition, and then it'll happen that way. It just depends, really. And the nice thing about doing a 3-show season is that the process is generally different for each production. We don't really have we have a formula, but it's loose, and it has to be flexible. We sort of have a way of working that we think works pretty well, but we're constantly kind of negotiating that and reinventing.
I love that idea of you're constantly reinventing even as you're growing. What does it mean then to you to grow? Is it size? Is it numbers? Is it visibility? Is it systems? What is it that, as an artistic director, what does growth mean to you?
Yeah. Well, it's all of those things that you mentioned, for sure. Those are I think the external validating markers of growth. Has our audience grown in size? Has our marketing capacity grown in size? Has our constituent base, our general constituent base grown? All of these markers are important, and we certainly take a lot of stock in them, for sure. I think, though, there's this added component of, to me, growth is kind of about trust and dependability, which kind of go hand in hand. Um, we're a pretty small internal crew. There's 4 or 5 of us that kind of work from an administrative standpoint on the festival. And we've really invested in those people, continue to invest in that core group. And we believe that, we've operated more and more deftly as an organization because of that shorthand between us that keeps getting tighter and tighter each season. And that, to me personally, I can only speak for myself, although I think I can speak for all of us, but it's about trust. It's about knowing that, like, if I present an idea to the group, it may take some convincing,
Mhm.
and I have to kind of be able to defend that idea. Any of us has to be able to defend an idea, but we never do anything without consensus. And if we have consensus, it's because we all are trusting in the other. And that, to me, is really where I think growth shows the most. Because if you don't have that trust, that consensus amongst your core collaborators, then you could just use your imagination, see how quickly the slope gets slippery.
Of course, of course. I love that as a core value of your company. Are there any other decisions that you made early on that still pay dividends today, in your opinion?
Well, I mentioned earlier this need for diversifying leadership. So after the Aliens summer, it was our first kind of full 3-show season. That was produced another Annie Baker play called Body Awareness, an Antoinette Nwandu play called Passover, and then Sylvan Oswald's play Pony. This was our first full season. We were multiple venues around the city, 50 artists, and just a huge undertaking for a group that had literally just produced, a one act play
Of course.
the year before. And as fate often works, I was all lined up to be in Maine that summer, producing the festival. I was supposed to act in one of our shows. And about 2 weeks before we opened our first show, I got the call that I had booked Fallout. And now all of a sudden, I was required to be in New York most weeks throughout the summer, Monday through Friday, or Monday through Thursday. So for the better part of 3 months of our very first full season, our second technical season, but really our first full season, I was in New York Monday through Friday, shooting intermittently. And then I was either driving or flying back up to Portland on the weekends to be present for the festival. And that's when I promoted Jen London from, production stage manager to managing director of the company. And that was hands down the single most impactful decision that I've had to make since starting the festival, because Jen, for anybody who knows her, and a lot of people listening to this podcast do, is one of those rare superhumans who just can do it all and can sort of intuit your needs before you can, and already has a 5-point action plan for how to achieve them before you've even had the thought.
When I directed Straight White Men, Jen London was actually my stage manager. And so I completely hear what you're saying is that she comes ready. She's a stage manager, production manager, managing director who's ready in the room and ready to sort of pitch those ideas. I love that. I love the idea of trusting sort of someone to sort of develop and grow. I think it sort of proves that all theater people, to a certain extent, have a certain level of capacity. I think that's what I love about theater people, is that we are so capable, even though we may be hard on ourselves at points, like our ability to sort of juggle multiple projects, multiple things, and be able to sort of drive that forward. We've been talking to Dave Register. We're going to take a quick break and we'll be right back.
At Forge Theater Labs, we're building bold, imaginative theater, supporting new artists, new stories, and new ways of experiencing performance. We're proud to share that Forge Theater Labs is now a sponsored project of Fractured Atlas, which means your donations are tax deductible and directly support the creation of this podcast, live tapings, and artist-driven projects. If our work has inspired you, made you think, or brought you closer to the theater community, we invite you to help keep it going. You can make a donation by visiting forgetheaterlabs.com for our link to our Fractured Atlas page. Every contribution, big or small, helps us forge new pathways for artists and audiences alike. Thank you for being part of our community.
We were just talking about sort of growing and capacity in leadership. And I thought I sort of pivot a little bit and talk a little bit about, what's next for PTF in the coming years. What kind of artists or projects are you especially excited to support now that PTF is more established?
Yeah. Well, so we've basically built our company over the last 5 years by producing plays that have had, a sort of successful off-Broadway and or kind of major regional run. And we're the first company to bring those plays to Maine. In most cases, I don't think I can lay claim to every single show we produce that we've done the Maine premiere, but close. With the idea being that there are just so many incredible plays, challenging, provocative, sort of timely, to use all of these kind of theater cliche words, but they're cliche because they're true. Plays that are really speaking to the times that we're living in right now. And our intention has always been to be useful in that sense, that we've ultimately wanted to have the art matter in that way, with the hopes that our audiences leave feeling changed, or at the very least ready to change maybe their thinking on an issue, or they're seeing the world in a slightly different way as a result of having watched the show. That being said, we've worked with a lot of amazing people, and we have not dipped into the new work category. We did that last year in a workshop setting. We launched a new initiative at the festival called the New Works Lab, where we brought in a writer and director combo from New York, and they put them in residency, housed them, created a space to work on a script that was very much in development for a week. We cast all local Portland / general Maine actors in the workshop, so that the creative team had great actors to work with. And then that process culminated in a public showing at the end of the week. And it was a huge success. And it really excited us, inspired us to want to do it again and to expand the program a bit. So what that looks like, we're still kind of fleshing it out, but we're in the next, I would say, month and a half, we're going to release applications for playwrights and directors to submit a proposal to come up and workshop a show. And first place, contestants will, of course, be granted the residency, and then, second and third runners up will get a cash prize. I mean, this is a formula that has been tried and tested at many theaters over the years. It's if you can afford it, it's a great thing to do. It's sadly often one of the first programs to get cut from theaters that are scaling back, is these new works initiatives, which is hard to see, but it's a widespread thing. We don't have a huge overhead right now, and we talk about growth. That's intentional. We're trying to keep it that way by staying sort of nimble and trying our best to keep our costs down, we can add on programs like this that are not huge expenses, but yield huge creative and artistic dividends. And so I think the thinking there is that, like, if we really believe in a brand new project, we really believe in a playwright or a young director, and not necessarily even a young playwright or director. I mean, we want the applications to be open to everybody, and they will be. But the idea is that we really believe in a project, no matter who creates it. We want to get behind that, and maybe that will turn into a full scale production in a future season. And we'd really like to eventually here become real meaningful incubators of new work, not just producers of already produced plays that have been done elsewhere.
Absolutely. I think, even as the head of Forge Theater Labs, I sort of deal with that sort of tension between being a curator and then also, a gate opener, also keeper at the same time. We want to be able to open as many gates. I want to work with as many people as possible, but yet I also want to make sure that we're sustaining, our brand, our thought process, the art that we're creating. How do you balance being a gate opener with being a curator?
Well, I'm that's a good question. I've been, I would say that my gate, if whatever gate opening I've done, um, outside of trying to helping to create jobs, at our festival for people, um, any sort of artistic gate opening that I've done for, let's say, writers or um, playwrights, is relatively newer terrain for me. I would consider myself, I think, more of a curator, in the sense that, like, Barry and I feel like we have a similar taste, and we program stuff that we really like and think is really good and are really passionate about. And um, and so in that sense, we are curating a season when we choose those plays. That being said, I do think the two kind of go hand in hand. I wouldn't necessarily say that it's always one or the other, because if you widen the notion of gatekeeping, I mean, I think, like, I think just I'm amazed. Like, we will have spent, at the end of this season, we will have spent over $1 million on making theater in Maine. Most of that money going to Maine artists.
Mm.
That's just a lot of money, and it means a lot. It's a lot of jobs. It's a lot of positions. And I hope, maybe I'm going out on a limb, but I'd hope, and I think that a lot of those collaborators would say that they felt that these opportunities were special ones, were meaningful, that they actually were not just jobs, but they were game changers in some sense, that they, were these artistic challenges that they've always wanted, and we created the space for them to really experiment and explore. And as a result, they felt like they grew artistically. Um, so I don't want to take credit for that entirely, because it is not the work of one person. We work with a team. But if I've done any of that gatekeeping stuff, it's in helping to create these jobs every summer that I think a
Yeah.
lot of our community has really grown to depend on. We're the only summer long professional enterprise in Portland, and a lot of other theaters, most of our other theaters in town go dark in the summertime. So we're really trying to fill that void, like providing that key employment.
Absolutely. And sort of providing that sort of year round, filling in the gaps where it is, sort of
Right.
making that discovery. I think one of the things that happened post pandemic was that, there was this resurgence of this need for theater, for in person theater. And I
Yeah.
think PTF at the top of my mind was one of those companies that filled that void, was to be like, hey, we're still here, we're still present, we're still innovating. And there are many other companies doing that. But obviously, the smoothness of your operation has always impressed me.
Oh,
Um,
thanks. Well, it's just
with
it. You see the smoothness, but it doesn't always feel smooth on the inside. But it's gotten a lot smoother.
Sure.
But yes,
I
thank
mean,
you. I appreciate it.
yeah, absolutely. Speaking of sort of smoothness and roughness, what is sort of perhaps a challenge at this time, 5 years in, that has surprised you?
Well, the big challenge that we talk about a lot right now, we're in the process of developing a strategic plan for the first time as an organization. And we're using a nonprofit consultant to do that. And which is just, it's crazy. When you're like, a strategic plan, what the fuck? Am I allowed to curse on this show?
Absolutely. Please do.
What the fuck is a strategic plan? Like, we're just trying to make plays, but we've really come to feel that we have something real and long-standing on our hands, and that if we can set up these certain parameters and structures in place now, then in theory, right, the festival can grow and can one day be handed off to somebody else. You know what I mean? That the thing is sort of larger than any one or two people. And I would say that in thinking about growth, we were talking about growth. One of the challenges um, is to stay thinking modestly and not get swept away in these kind of grandiose visions of what the company could be.
Hmm.
I live in New York when I'm not in Maine in the summer, and I see shows at St. Anne's Warehouse or Park Ave Armory, or site specific shows through other companies, or even shows on Broadway, and I think we should be able to do that. And it's like, these are 10 to $20 million a year companies that have been around for in some cases decades, and they're able to do that particular thing because of where they are, so it's like honoring where we are and not trying to take on you know uh growth that we can't sustain, not trying to jump the gun
Hmm.
on growth is oddly enough the biggest challenge right now. It's like, let's just keep doing. We've For the last few summers, we've I think really sharpened and fine-tuned a specific model, and it's like, let's just keep doing that with incremental growth, incremental changes and shifts, but let's just see if we can keep tightening this model before we take on any additional risk that we potentially might not be able to ultimately support.
I love that. I mean, I think that's such an important lesson for emerging artistic directors to sort of take to heart. And with that in mind, we're going to take another quick short break and we'll wrap things up talking a little bit about your experience as a director. You're listening to Forge Theater Labs. We're talking to Dave Register. We'll be right back. Want to get your brand in front of a passionate, creative, and engaged audience? Forge Theater Labs is looking for partners to sponsor this podcast and join us in bringing bold, innovative theater to life. If you'd like to place an ad right here, reach out to us at marketing@forgetheaterlabs.com. It's a simple, powerful way to support the arts while sharing your message with listeners who care about creativity and community. Again, that's marketing@forgetheaterlabs.com. Let's build something extraordinary together. Welcome back. We're talking to Dave Register about his experience as an AD at Portland Theater Festival. This past season, he also directed Deep Blue Sound for the first time, sort of, coming in as a professional director. And I thought it'd be a nice time to sort of talk about that and your experience about this. Let's start with this first. For those of our listeners who don't know what Deep Blue Sound is, can you kind of describe the play for us?
Deep Blue Sound, written by Abe Kugler. It's a play that takes place on sort of it's ostensibly Vashon Island in the Pacific Northwest, off the coast of Seattle. The island itself isn't ever mentioned in the play, but it's Vashon. It's based on Vashon, and the story is sort of it's largely about this community of people. I think of them as kind of island bizarros, people with distinct personalities, particular personalities that are unique to people who make decisions like deciding to live on small islands. And they they struggle in and out of love. They grapple with decisions as to whether or not to stay or leave the island. They battle illness and loneliness, and they find tremendous amounts of hope and perseverance. That's broad strokes. It's a play that it's funny, it's tender, it's all of the great things that I love in a play. And from the moment I saw it, I just knew that I wanted to direct it, and I wanted to do it in Maine. It felt like the most Maine, quote unquote, play, even though it takes place in the Pacific Northwest, that I had ever, read. It was getting at some truths about people who live in parts of the world like where we live in Maine, that without indicating or without commenting on that just Abe had done this incredible job of just creating these characters who simply are these people. Speaks to his brilliance. So that's I don't want to say too much more for anybody who's interested in going to read it or who hasn't seen it.
I'm going to sort of press you a little bit because, yes, obviously we want them to read it. We don't want to spoil it for them. But what was it particularly that about this play that spoke to you about Maine? Like, what was that sort of parallel that you saw?
Well, first of all, it's in the language. The language for me is always the beginning place of any story that I'm personally drawn to. So how do these people talk? And the best way I can describe them is people for whom seemingly small or trivial concerns for others, right, who don't live in small towns, for whom, are kind of seismic, life-changing big deals. So people making big deals out of seemingly small things, but that passion and the commitment to the things that they believe are true and into their way of life and to the things that they believe are right and good, that passion and that commitment is what ultimately makes them lovable, relatable, able to sympathize with. And I just felt like these were people that I'd grown up with. Like I knew these people. And in some ways I am one of these people, I've had a little bit of it shaken out of me with living in New York for so long, but we are ultimately who we are. And, I saw myself in that, I saw myself in this community of people. And I felt that, the play takes place on an island. We produced it on Mackworth Island. We were given access to Baxter School for the Deaf to produce the play in. And it just, again, sort of right place, right time, right people. And I had the kind of my dream cast, and I could just see it all like in Portland as I was watching it in New York. And that it's just when you get those rare moments of inspiration, I think you really have to follow them.
Absolutely. I think one of the things that really appeals to me about this play, and, it speaks to it a little bit without giving away too much, is that the world is as big as you make it. right?
Yeah.
Like it's about the world you inhabit is everything you know, and maybe walking outside gives you perspective, but that doesn't invalidate your original experience or those that you've left behind in that world. And I thought that was something that you captured beautifully within that play. Um, was there a moment when you realized, oh, I didn't see that coming? Like, this was actually a surprise. Like, I had this vision for this play, and maybe there were some adjustments that, needed to happen in the room about your perspective, your thoughts, your vision.
Yes, there were, I mean, first of all, directing Deep Blue Sound, as you pointed out, it was my first time directing a play. I've been an artistic director who hasn't directed up until now. And I was feeling a little insecure about that. I was like, I gotta get up. I gotta do this. I've worked with a lot of great directors. I've admired directors. I've done some versions of directing through teaching, but I got to do this. I got to just put this to the test. And there's so many great books and so much great writing on directing. But I think the greatest piece of advice that I got, before going into Deep Blue Sound was, prepare like hell leading up to it, and then be prepared to let everything that you prepared go.
Absolutely.
And that is both the most freeing and terrifying thing that anybody can tell you for somebody who likes to have a handle on things, likes to have a certain sense of control over things, which, have to when running the festival from a producer side. But then when you're directing, you just can't hold on too tight. Otherwise it shows, one of the beautiful things about Deep Blue Sound, and I will say that I probably got lucky on this, is that, I had a really clear vision for how I wanted it to go. And I took a lot of time casting it. And I hired my good friend, Ben Wheelwright, who's a very accomplished movement director in New York City. He was the resident U.S. movement director for Harry Potter and the Cursed Child for 5 years, and was in the original Broadway production with me. That's how we knew each other. I hired Ben to come up and do these ensemble building exercises with the cast for the entire first week of rehearsal. So before we even got into the text, we were all just moving around in the woods of Mackworth Island together, doing these strange exercises. And as a result, our cast felt like a real community. It just felt like a group of people that had known each other for a really long time. And in some cases, indeed, some of those actors have known each other for a long time. But, the work that we did with Ben was so vital and so important that it just helped sustain the vision over the course of the process that I brought into it. And there were small things throughout the production that needed to change. There were when I brought in Ben, for example, I did not expect there to be any choreography, quote unquote, or any sort of stage movement incorporated into the actual show itself. I just wanted us to feel like an ensemble. I want us to have that experience of working together as a company before we got into table work. And Ben arrived and we started rehearsing, and like within minutes, of us working together, I could start to see these sequences that I knew just had to make it into the play. And so now I'm going home at the end of rehearsals and going, well, I got to figure out where to put that in now. This wasn't part of the play, but now I got to put this in. The staging was somewhat unconventional for our production, since that, most of the actors were on stage for most of the show. And only towards the very end were people actually leaving stage, and only for a couple minutes at a time. A lot of the stuff that had to shift or alter would happen, when we would really start to get into our runs. You're like, oh yeah, I have this person standing over here, but now they have to make an entrance from the other side of the stage, and doesn't make any fucking sense at all for them to stand over here. And you look at yourself and you go, why did I put them over here in the first place? But you just, these are the things that I found those to be the joys of directing and going, yeah, you're just learning as you go. And as long as you don't take yourself too seriously, there's really no small mistake that you can't fix or find a solve for, I don't think.
Absolutely. There's always solutions. I think, for me, directing is about the connective tissue. It's about taking, what the actors are doing in two different scenes and finding that connective tissue, whether that's ahead of time, whether that's in the room. I always say to my students, prepare, but at the end of the day, what questions are you asking? Are you ready to ask questions? Not prepare with a statement, not prepare with, this is what we're doing. It's, what are we doing? Right. What is this in this moment that we need to invite into the room in order to make it happen? And I think that's sort of the beauty, and making those discoveries that make you feel alive or generative, asking the right questions that will lead your cast, your crew, your design team into that. That I think is the heart of directing. So thank you for mentioning that. I find that connective tissues are often what make a great play great. It's like not just what's happening on stage when people are speaking, but how we get from point A to point B. And that, I think, was the beauty of Deep Blue Sound, was finding those moments to get us into the next beat and lead us and guide us into that next phase.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I mean, somebody said, I don't know who to attribute this quote to, but somebody said that, art doesn't solve problems, it just formulates them in the right way. It's just it's not about coming in and presenting a strong a thesis statement that's this inflexible thesis that's trying to tell you what to do, but it's raising questions, as you pointed out, and hopefully laying them bare for people to, in a certain arrangement, for people to make sense of them as they will on their own terms.
Exactly. And sometimes that's confrontational. Sometimes that's, smooth and easy. I've been in both positions before. What's a lesson from Deep Blue Sound that you think you'll carry into your next project, either as a director or as an artistic director?
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you this, if I can, and I'll tease, and the only thing I'll tease about our coming season here is that plays about large community groups really hit in our community, and we want to do more of that, and we plan to do more of that. I was scared to do a play. I mean, we did our Make Believe was a cast of 8, I believe, or 8, and Deep Blue Sound was 9, and that was by far, those two shows are by far the largest shows we'd produced. I think Wolf Play was 5. That's the biggest one. Pony was 5. But, talking about producing a show with twice as many people, it was scary, Are we going to be able to pay for this? Are we able to manage a cast of that size with everybody's schedules and conflicts? But, it was a very smooth process, fortunately. And it, I think, inspired all of us to want to do more of that. And so from an artistic director perspective, I want to keep, this has opened up a whole new tier of type of show that we feel confident now that we can produce. So there's more of that coming. From a directing standpoint, I mean, gosh, it's really back to basics. It's like how, like the power in being able to do so much with so little, if you have a clear vision and you have your cast. Like Deep Blue Sound is a play. It's a language play. It is a very tech light show, and we did not add any bells or whistles. This was done on an old gymatorium stage that was built in the 1950s, minimal lighting, minimal sound equipment, a few set pieces that we rolled on and off the stage. And then everything else was about the clarity of language, the clarity of the relationships between the characters, the particularization of the moment to moment work from each actor. And that's just, again, it's like directors, different projects call for different needs, or different directors, apply their varied visions onto different projects. But gosh, I was just I was reminded, you don't need as much as you think you do to do something really, to try to do something really great. And so I'm excited to figure out what that next thing's going to be. I would say this too. Some directors just direct for the sake of directing, and I admire that a lot. Like directors who have that passion, like, oh, I take any script, and figure that out. Like, I don't think that's me. I don't necessarily think that I would take on a script unless I felt really, quite passionate about it personally. I just think that that play is in better hands with somebody who feels differently, So excited to see what that next thing is. I don't know what it's going to be. I have a couple ideas, but we'll see. We'll see what happens down the line.
Well, thank you, Dave, for joining us today. That's our time today.
Thanks, Josh.
Anything that you want to shout out before we go? Where can we follow you next? What should we be watching? Anything for our listeners?
Well, just thanks for giving me the opportunity for talking, to talk to you today. This was great. I always love chatting with you, Josh, and I'm a big fan of what you're doing with Forge. So thanks for including me. I have to just, first and foremost, I just want to shout out Jen London, PTF Managing Director, Barry Robinson, Associate Artistic Director, Peter Bloom, our Technical Director, Tom Haushalter, our Director of Marketing and Communications. It's our core group. These are the folks that I talk to creatively the most often in my life. And I'd be remiss if I didn't also shout out my fiance, Juliana Sass, who is PTF's literary director, who reads plays with a kind of fervor and passion that I can only dream of having, and is singularly responsible for shaping and changing the way that I think about theater all the time, every day. So I'm very lucky to have a partner like that, and also a coworker. PTF, we're going to be back next summer, 2026. We'll be doing 3 more shows. We'll be picking up in late June and running into early September as usual. You can follow us at Portland Theater Fest on Facebook or Instagram. That's where we're the most active. Our website is portlandtheaterfestival.com. And if you haven't watched Fallout yet on Amazon Prime, get to it. You can see all of season 2 is out now. It's ready to binge if that's your thing. It's a really great show, and I have a small part in it, but it's an amazing world. There's something in it for everybody. So check it out if you haven't.
Absolutely. I've been loving personally Daddy Chet, so please check that out. Thanks so much. This is Forge Theater Labs. We'll be back soon. Take care, all.
This episode was hosted by Joshua N Hsu with post-production by Sam Rapaport.